Hello, I'm Terry Christensen, and this is Valley Politics. Today our show is a one-hour special on a turning point in the history of the Valley. It's about the time when the county and the cities awakened to the costs of rampant, uncontrolled growth, a time when San Jose alone grew from 95,000 people in 1950 to 400,000 in 1970, aided and abetted by the county and with no serious planning. We'll talk about how managed growth came to the Valley, and about the legacy of those years of sprawling growth, as well as the land use challenges we face today. And that's what's coming up on Valley Politics. Welcome everyone, and welcome to our guests, three of whom were participants in the tumultuous politics of land use planning in the Valley in the 70s, and one of whom wasn't around then, but is a current leader on local land use policy. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll get right into our conversation. Don Weden, we'll start with you.
I'm Don Weden. I worked for Santa Clara County Planning for 34 years, starting in 1969.
And I'm Megan Medieros. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Committee for Green Foothills and have been an active open space advocate for 17 years.
Okay. Gary.
Gary Schoennauer. I worked for the City of San Jose for 30 years, retired as Planning Director in 1997. So pretty much saw the rapid growth period from the 70s through the late 90s.
Rod.
Terry, I'm Rod Diridon, Senior. I was a city council member in Saratoga from 1971 to 75, and then on the County Board of Supervisors, serving 6 times as chair from 1975 to 1995, and then continued to be active in environmental organizations after that.
Well, thank you all again for being here. Let's start just by talking about what was happening in the 50s and 60s that produced the sprawling growth in the Valley. Don, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you, Terry. Well, I'll use the same 1950 sort of benchmark that you did. If you look back to Santa Clara County in 1950, we had only 8 cities at that time, total population under 300,000. It was mostly agriculture. If you looked across the valley, you'd see orchards from one side to the other. San Jose was the largest city with about a third of the county's population at that time. But the rest was was living on farms or in small towns for the most part. And we were known worldwide as being the Valley of Heart's Delight, both for the bucolic setting we had, as well as the produce that was shipped.
All the orchards.
All the orchards, all that thing. Fast forward to 1970, we went from 8 cities to 15. We went from 300,000 people to over 1 million people. And sprawling, chaotic development had sort of covered over a lot of the orchards that had been there, that had been the hallmark of the valley previously. It was almost like a checkerboard. You'd find a subdivision, farms, that sort of thing. If you're looking at the physical landscape, if you're looking at the political landscape, it was more like octopuses wrestling. It was like the tentacles going in every which way. The cities had followed very aggressive and very inefficient annexation policies to get to that point. And unlike the 1950s, when the Valley had a very positive national image, we went to the image of being the poster child for uncontrolled urban sprawl and how bad things could go if you didn't manage things well. Why did that happen? I think there are 2 basic things. There were some national forces that were responsible for it, as well as local conditions. The national forces go back to the end of World War II and what we needed as a nation. We had several things going on, one of which was we had soldiers coming back from war who needed peacetime jobs, civilian jobs. Building more bombs or airplanes or whatever wasn't really needed at that point. The war was over. So we needed to transform our economy into a peacetime economy. We also had to build more housing for what became the baby boom generation, the families that were created after the war and then had babies and needed the backyards for the kids and the swings and slides and all that sort of thing that sort of led to suburbia. On top of that was the federal government recognizing that we needed to go in those directions. It was offering subsidies for all sorts of things to encourage home ownership, to encourage cities to sprawl. I think in the 70s you could get a 90% sewer grant from the federal government to expand your sewage treatment plant. So growth had practically almost no cost to the city on the front end like that. And then another 5% from the state, if I remember correctly. And then on top of that was the completion of the interstate highway system, which made it possible for people to work in one place and and live quite far distance away and get there conveniently, which they wouldn't have been able to do without the freeway system that we built. At the local level, there were a combination of three things, one of which was the attractiveness of the area that brought many of the GIs who passed through California on their way to the war or were stationed here during the war, decided after they got home to snowy Minnesota after the war that where am I going to spend the rest of my life? And California was that big magnet where you could just reach out and pluck those oranges off the trees and so on. Second thing was the boomtown attitudes that existed in this area. And the third was sort of a Wild West regulatory environment. Let me just quickly touch on each one. The attractiveness I've already mentioned. We had the mild climate. We had the natural beauty of the area. There were employment opportunities as the aerospace and electronics industry was getting started in Santa Clara County. There also were a lot of jobs in construction that was sort of self-fulfilling, was feeding on itself. Construction begat more construction, so to speak. And finally, there was flat, developable land that made it easy for the developers to develop. Now, the boomtown attitudes were some that seem quite quaint today, but back then there was sort of an unquestioned notion that growth is good.
Growth is good.
Growth is good. Bigger is better. That was sort of the civic mentality. We want our city to be bigger because we want to have a bigger tax base or bigger bragging rights or whatever it was that, the sort of macho civic competition was going on. There also was an assumption that all new development was going to pay its own way, that you didn't matter where the development occurred, you'd get more than enough revenue from it, tax revenue, that you didn't even have to pay any attention to that. And then finally, there was the profitability of it, in a sense. Everyone made money from the conversion. The farmer made money, got more for his land, her land, than it was worth as for farming. The person who bought it, the developer, then put value added by building homes on there. The construction crews that worked on it, the landscapers, the electricians, the stores that sold furniture. You can go on and on and on, including the newspapers that got more subscribers and didn't have any particular reason to call attention to
the car dealers
and the car. Yes, indeed. So that was sort of the boomtown attitudes that contributed. And then finally was the sort of the Wild West regulatory environment. California had not previously experienced such a substantial job growth probably since the gold rush, and so its laws were really inadequate to deal with what was happening, the regulatory framework. And so cities could incorporate fairly easily or could annex lands very easily. There was no one to say that this land can only annex to one city or to that city. They were competing with one another. And the special districts made that even easier. The special districts were another part of the mix, was that since we had sanitation district that provides sewer service to many of the new subdivisions, a developer didn't have to get, the city was almost irrelevant. If you can get sewer connection from the developer, you can develop either in the county or in a city, or you may even have two cities you can play off against. If I annex to your city, what will you let me do? If I annex to your city, what will I get? And the cities, since they were competing, were sort of bought into that. And the county was still acting as it were the 16th city, and Eastridge was approved.
The county was doing development on county land.
Yes, Eastridge Shopping Center was originally approved by the county.
We're going to come to Rod to talk about that a little bit. I just want to throw in, when we talk about the kind of growth that was happening, it's important for people, younger people, to know it was tract housing, single-family houses on separate lots, with fairly big lots often, with a backyard and a front yard and a side driveway and so on. Very low density development. This was also facilitated by another federal policy, and that was the GI Bill. My parents bought their first tract house on a GI Bill, no money down, 4%, I think it might have been 3% interest. So this is a working class family. They could actually easily afford to do that, just shifting their rent over to a minimal mortgage payment. So the GI Bill really helped, and tract housing was the dominant mode. Rod, what do you want to add about what was happening in this area?
Well, I think one of the subtle things that was occurring at that time is that local government, which has land use control in California, was controlled by the farming interests. You're a farmer, or you supported the farming industry with trucking, meat packing plants or fruit packing plants and those kinds of things. But virtually all of the industry in the 50s and 60s was farm related. As a consequence, those people were the ones elected to city councils and the boards of supervisors and therefore controlled zoning. And so you had an unholy alliance between organizations that should have been controlling each other. Instead, they were abetting each other in terms of this terrible urban sprawl that was crippling the farming industry, truly, because it was taking the land out of farming. and it was crippling our ability to provide urban services because the lifelines were being extended up into the hills and great distances, costing more money to provide.
So Gary Schoennauer, what was going on with the city at this time? You joined the city planning department in 1967.
Yes, in 1967, as Don pointed out, the population of the county had gone from 95,000 people at the end of the war to over 400,000 by the 70s. And that growth, half of that growth, was taking place in San Jose.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, Terry, the GI Bill. San Jose, most of the jobs and the industry after in the 70s was being located in the north side of the north end of the county for the most part, around Stanford University,
Yeah.
high tech, even then, and industrial development surrounded by or encouraged by the post-war period. But the housing was being built in San Jose. And between the highways being expanded, Highway 101 was expanded from a old 4-lane highway to a major freeway all the way through San Jose, made it very feasible for someone to buy a house in the middle of San Jose, south end of San Jose, and work in Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, wherever. So that growth was really pushing San Jose. San Jose also had a philosophy to encourage that growth, as Don pointed out, by encouraging landowners to annex to San Jose. And the city manager, Dutch Hammond, at the time, probably had the reputation of being the most effective of all the city's annexation czars, if you will, in promoting annexation of property. He had his people go out to a farmer in South San Jose or Almaden Valley or Berryessa and say, if you come to San Jose, we'll extend sewers, we'll let you build your houses, and that process just multiplied and multiplied. San Jose was growing like an octopus in every direction. And the bottom line is it was more effective than some of the other cities. You could argue that if San Jose hadn't have been as effective as it was in the annexation wars, there'd probably be another 5 or 6 cities in Santa Clara County today, because other cities would have taken advantage.
Let's roll back a little bit. Explain what an annexation war is.
Well, during that period, there were no regulations on how to control the annexation of land to a city. In order to join a city, you had, under state law, you had to annex to that city. And all it required was the property owner to agree to with that city that they would come to that city. They had to be connected. It couldn't be a skipped situation. So what the city would do is encourage property owners along a stretch out to a property owner to get it to annex. For example, the city of Cupertino exists today because the farmers and landowners in Cupertino at the time did not want to become part of West San Jose. So they incorporated the city of Cupertino.
Called defensive incorporation.
To stop the San Jose. Otherwise, Cupertino wouldn't exist. And Apple headquarters today
Would be in San Jose.
San Jose.
San Jose.
And I mean,
Yeah.
it's ironic when you think about that history.
So San Jose really had a political machine that was supporting growth. Hammond was the city manager. City council was supportive. The interests Rod talked about, landowning interests were supporting it. The Mercury News, Joe Ritter said trees don't read newspapers, so he didn't want orchards. He wanted people in houses buying his newspaper.
Absolutely.
So there was a really considerable force behind growth. And I guess back to Don's point, people thought growth was a good thing too, mostly.
Well, and one of the things was that this growth didn't cost you anything as a city at the time.
Well, that's what, yeah.
And so,
We'll come to that.
yeah, eventually we're going to find out how that wasn't
Yeah.
true. But this was just tax money. So the city's revenues every year were growing phenomenally because the property tax base was growing like crazy. The early 70s, I remember there were a couple of years where there'd be 20,000 new single-family lots approved just in San Jose alone,
Wow.
which is phenomenal. And again, the price tag for what it was going to cost in services to that community wasn't even an issue.
And San Jose used its control over the sewage treatment plant to push people to annex and also access to water, right?
Correct.
Rod, did you?
Terry, two things happened at this time. One was that you had a new group of politicians elected, and it caused a real concern for the environment, or maybe there was a growing concern for the environment. So you had a new group of politicians elected who are not involved in the farming community and who are all full-time political leaders.
Well, we had a population of 400,000.
Yeah.
About 300,000 of whom had come to the city and
New.
weren't engaged in agriculture and
the other
agricultural
thing
trade.
that happened
canning.
was what Gary just mentioned, was that the tax base, which had been growing rampantly because it was property tax based, was killed with the adoption of Proposition 13, which made property tax much less valuable in the development of city budgets.
Okay, that's 1978, so you're leaving a little bit ahead of us here. We're ready to start talking about what made all this change. How did the Valley wake up to the costs of growth and development, and where did those new elected officials come from? What made the change?
Well, I think there's sort of three forces or factors that sort of converged to bring it about. One of them was the state legislature. And it wasn't an economic argument, so it was partly an economic argument, but what was happening throughout California was similar to what had happened in Santa Clara County, the rapid, uncontrolled growth, creation of special districts, some of which overextended themselves and started going bankrupt. And so the state, Governor Jerry Brown's dad, Governor Edmund Brown at that time, created a commission to look at growth in California and what we could do. Because the other thing is, agriculture was our primary industry, and that was the one that was being most threatened and most being impacted by this rapid, uncontrolled, unplanned sort of growth. They did a study. They came back and came up with a suggestion that there be commissions established to govern the expansion of cities and tougher restrictions as to how cities can be formed and how they can annex, and that they had to get somebody's approval rather than simply getting the consent, as Gary said, of the property owner. And they came up with a proposal to create what were called local agency formation commissions, or LAFCOs.
LAFCO.
LAFCO, right.
Local agency
One in each county in California. Originally, the proposal was to make them regional, so it would have been.
That would have been interesting.
That would have been interesting, but it didn't have much political support from local government, as you can imagine.
No.
So it got pushed down to the county level. So anyway, about 1963 or so, LAFCOs were mandated in each county. So they were starting to look at what their responsibilities were in terms of reining in this sort of untrammeled sort of rampant growth. At the same time, the cities were beginning to see that this pattern that was developing here was not very good from an accountability standpoint for local government. If you don't know whether you serve this parcel here on this side of the street, but there's another city here and then there's a county here, it's very difficult for any sort of accountability, for any sort of service delivery efficiency. So the cities realized that something was not right. And when I came to work for the county, actually I didn't work for long-range planning. I worked in a section called the Metropolitan Coordination Section, because back then the cities realized that they were all in this together. They met monthly, and they, instead of looking at it simply through as though they were separate islands, they saw themselves as part of a larger county, and so they were the ones who got involved in doing all sorts of planning. But one of the things they did was helping to develop urban development policies for Santa Clara County. How do we clean up this mess within the confines of recognize that we're going to have to do something because LAFCOs are coming down? At the same time, San Jose was having an awakening as to the cost, the economics, what sometimes was called the cost-revenue consequences of development, that it wasn't all gravy, so to speak, for the cities, that not everything did pay its own way, especially if you factor in the long-term maintenance. It may up front when the fees and so on, the developer may build the roads and pay some fees and so on, but when the city has to maintain those or sewer lines over a long period of time, the revenues may not be there. And that was one of the awakenings for San Jose, certainly, that brought them and LAFCO and the county all together to adopt a set of county-wide urban development policies.
Both San Jose and Palo Alto did studies in the late 60s, early 70s about the costs and benefits of growth, and woke up to the reality that actually there are more costs than benefits in many cases, especially if you're developing a lot of housing that requires a lot of service. And there was a change in city manager in 1969. Dutch Hammond left San Jose. Tom Fletcher became the new manager.
Yes, Dutch retired. I think he was very smart and astute enough to see the political change that was coming on the city council, because some new city council members were elected back in that period. Susie Wilson's one, Walter Hayes, Janet Gray Hayes, who ultimately became mayor.
Virginia Schaefer earlier in the 60s, who was a critic
of the growth,
yeah,
and spending. And they began to realize that the cost to provide services to this sprawled, low-density development, and later on we'll talk about the fact that there's a big difference between the cost to provide housing that's high density and infill versus the low-density sprawl that San Jose was experiencing at the time. But again, the bill didn't come due for a few years later than 1970, with all this growth that was taking place. When Tom Fletcher came from after Dutch retired from San Diego, and San Diego had done some of this urban development policy look, brought the whole idea to San Jose and Santa Clara County, and between the city and Santa Clara County, what was adopted in 1970 in San Jose was the urban development policy. And that was the first time the political leadership of San Jose basically made the statement that we can't have sprawl development all over the hillsides, the Baylands, Coyote Valley, South Almaden Valley. And so all of those areas were placed in what was called an urban reserve or non-urban area. And that pretty much, for San Jose at least, sort of stopped the annexation wars because it was contained now within the urban boundary. And any change to that boundary required city council approval. The city manager couldn't go out and negotiate with the property owner and cut a deal on annexations like they used to do. But there was already annexations that sprawled all the way down to Morgan Hill, around Lake Anderson. Because in the late 60s and 70s, the city had annexed that territory, made commitments to the property owner to allow mega development around that area. And it was all based upon a strip annexation along Monterey Highway, because they went along, all those property owners along Monterey Highway, and said, if you sign up to join the city of San Jose someday, we're going to extend a sewer line out here and you're going to be able to develop. And of course, if you owned prune orchard at the time, and you could see prunes on one hand versus 100 single-family houses built on your property, there wasn't a lot of debate in the mind of the property owner.
Those were called cherry stem annexations.
cherry stem annexation, just a little strip of land.
The little strip of land and then an annexation.
Yeah.
And what that fomented was leapfrog, low-density urban sprawl, which was terrible.
Leapfrog, so you annex this piece,
And then you
skip this piece, jump over it to the next
orchards,
piece. Yeah.
and developed another piece.
Yeah.
And to
But
do
then
that,
that would only rationalize the absorption of all of the other land.
that's right, in between. It made farming unviable and those properties in between. I think two things happened that were very dominant in that time. First of all, those professional planners who understood how terrible this was began to write articles. Belzer, what was the?
Carl Belzer.
Carl
Carl
Belzer.
Belzer,
County
the
planning
the
director.
county planning director, got himself fired because he published criticisms of what the county was doing in terms of leapfrog urban sprawl. And Gary almost got himself fired by writing articles about how bad it was in the city. And that then fomented the election of a completely new crop of young politicians. Young, I mean, heck, I was 30 years old, and I didn't know which end was up. And I was elected to a city council seat and then a board of supervisor seat. And at that time, you had a complete turnover from the old farming interest holding all of those seats to, by 1974, the board of supervisors had a brand new board except for one person. Grand old Sig Sanchez was the only carryover, and all the rest of us were full-time board members, all with graduate degrees, all committed to
But
stopping urban
Dominic
sprawl.
Cortese was elected in 1970, I think.
70 with Dom,
Dan
Dan McCorkadale 72,
you in
and Jerry
74.
Steinberg and I in 74.
Right.
By 74, you had a brand new board, and it was absolutely determined to stop urban sprawl. And that was our primary mandate.
And about the same timing was happening with the city. This started when Ron James was mayor.
Yes, when
Then Norm Mineta follows him in 71 and Janet Gray Hayes in 74. And then, as you said, new members of the council who were some relatively new arrivals to San Jose.
Well, and there were changes in the state law too, in addition to LAFCO. There were changes in the state law that also imposed the Environmental Quality Act on local land use decisions in the early 70s that didn't exist before. So that was a whole nother review
Right.
that had to take place before you could approve development. And the state law changed to require all subdivision maps to conform to the city's general plan, or they couldn't be approved. And so in a place like San Jose, where we were approving subdivisions left and right on these newly annexed lands, no one paid attention to what kind of a general plan existed or anything else. And so in 74, I became the city's chief of planning, which was sort of head of the long-range planning operation. And we lobbied the city manager at the time, who was Ted Tedesco by then, that we needed a new general plan. And so the city council, mayor, endorsed the concept of what became GP 75. And this was the first general plan developed in San Jose that was community-based. The majority of the membership of the task force were neighborhood association
I was on
members. You were on it?
I was on it.
And the developers now, quote, sort of lost control of that process. And GP 75 was the first plan that incorporated the urban development policy. And so now the urban development policy wasn't just a policy statement. It had the legal teeth of the law, state law, that the general plan provided for.
Let's let Megan get in on this. We're getting into your era, not quite.
Here we go. So, Committee
If
for
you're
Green
just being
Foothills was
born.
around this time. I'm not going to say when I was born in this conversation. So, we're talking about a lot of different players right now, and the city staff, county staff, elected officials, these task force developers, farmers. But one piece that we've left out is the community. And it was the community who were electing these new leaders. And this was the will of the community to see a shift in how our region was growing. And Committee for Green Foothills, Sierra Club, Greenbelt Alliance, and others were a part of that movement. So I just think it's important to call that out as well.
There was a big neighborhood movement at this time,
Yeah.
neighborhood organizing movement. There were 300 some neighborhood organizations and associations in San Jose by the late 1970s. And one way that showed up was 1973, when some moms in the Almaden Valley got an initiative on the ballot. It was Measure B. Got an initiative on the ballot that said no more housing unless the schools sign off that they can absorb the kids. And it passed in San Jose over the campaigns of the old guard and the developers and so on. That was a really important turning point that, as you said, came from the community, not even from the political leadership. But that same community was electing leaders like Rod Diridon. You ran as a no-growth candidate.
I ran as an anti-growth candidate, and I began to realize that that's impossible. If you're going to have industrial expansion,
Yeah.
you have to have some growth. But then I began to work very hard on things like transportation and infill housing and so on. But let me mention something. Gary and the city of San Jose were doing a good job in terms of doing master planning and so on, but the county was still out there allowing leapfrog urban sprawl into the county without annexing to a city. And it wasn't until the late 70s when we finally got control of that at an epic meeting one night. We were on TV, I remember, at that time. It was right after Prop 13, and we still had a little bit of money before we ran out. And we got 4 votes on the Board of Supervisors to require the planning department to reject any subdivision application after that meeting. It was an emergency action, required 4 votes out of the 5, and at that point we stopped urban sprawl.
Is that when the 4x4 subdivisions
That's
were
when we
halted?
stopped the 4x4s.
Yeah.
And
Explain how that worked.
well, the 4x4s were the most insidious thing that's ever happened to the county. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, the old board members thought they were putting something over on folks by saying, we're going to stop urban sprawl by allowing only a piece of property divided into 4 parcels. Well, they didn't say how many times that could happen. And so you had a piece of property divided into 4 parcels, and in the next week, each one of those 4 parcels was subdivided into 4 parcels, and the following week, each of those parcels was divided until you had a subdivision. And that was happening rampantly across the beautiful surface of the valley, which was carpeted with blossoms up until that time. And it was happening in a leapfrog manner, which meant you had to extend services through a whole bunch of unpopulated area in order to serve something like the villages, for example, or other far distant suburban developments. And that was stopped at that evening meeting with Jerry Steinberg and Dan McCorkadale and myself and Dom Cortese, saying that there would be no more applications accepted as of the next morning at the county planning department. We had to do it that way because if we'd gone through the normal noticing process of 30 days with an ordinance that wasn't an emergency ordinance, we would have been flooded with subdivision applications of all the property out there. So we had to stop it before we could be flooded, because once the application was pending, we couldn't stop the development.
We're going to wrap up this segment and move on to the legacy of this kind of growth. Don, last words, briefly.
Just a quick thing.
Okay.
We've overlooked the policies, the urban development, the fundamental urban development policies that have governed this valley ever since the 70s, the LAFCO policies, which basically comes down to this. One of which is the county should not be in the urban development business.
But we were.
Well, we were for a few years. It took a little while for a number of
So
ordinances
the
to
county
catch up.
does no more urban
We don't
development
approve
after
urban
a certain
uses
point?
in rural areas.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Secondly, that the city should plan for orderly urban growth using formally adopted urban service area boundaries,
Yeah.
which are governed by LAFCO. Once they've been submitted, then expanding that in the future is governed by LAFCO. And the third part of that was that the unincorporated islands that have been created during the rampant growth
be
should annex
absorbed.
into the city,
Yeah.
absorbed into their city.
And
So
that's
that-
mostly happened.
yeah, yeah. For the most part, yeah, except
Yeah.
for some of the bigger ones are left. But we
Yeah.
made a lot of progress in getting rid of them.
Yeah.
But I think that we need to recognize that is the framework for development today. That it took a while, as Rod indicated, for the county's ordinances and practices to catch up with being out of the urban development business, but eventually it did, and that's
So by 1980 or so, cities had urban development boundaries.
they had them in the early 70s.
In the early
by
70s.
By 73,
Yeah.
the last of the city,
Yes.
LAFCO had approved the last
And
of the
the
city's
idea was
service.
you develop within these boundaries and they change only?
You had to demonstrate that you didn't have enough vacant land within it to accommodate future growth or a certain amount of future growth, then you could expand outward. But in recent years, it's become even more restrictive in the sense that maybe our future is urban, and we ought to even, it's not just a matter of having vacant land. If you have redevelopable land, that ought to be counted.
Yeah.
So that's made a fundamental change in Santa Cruz.
And from 73 on, I mean, San Jose's urban service area boundary essentially hasn't changed. Yet the population's more than doubled.
Yeah.
Right. But we live with the planning that was done in that era.
No blank slates out
Well,
there.
and you pointed out the school issue.
Yeah.
That was one that really raised a big red flag, because that was one of the first issues that showed that this new development could not support itself anymore. And it was
Everybody could understand that.
It was
And this was a
depicted in-
town of families with kids. so-
Absolutely, and
yeah.
schools were on double sessions.
Yeah.
Schools could not build enough schools, and that was just the schools. But then, police and fire protection and street maintenance and libraries and everything else weren't as obvious, but they were still services that weren't being provided because of the low density sprawl.
Right, so here we are, almost 50 years later from when this whole process started, living with the legacy of this kind of sprawling growth. Megan,
What do I have to say about it?
yeah, this is you're the committee for Green Foothills. Fortunately, we do have Green Foothills.
Yeah.
Declare
or we
victory.
will in the spring again, not
Yeah.
right now.
Not right now. Well, I mean, one thing to point out, and I think we'd all agree that while sprawl we're doing a lot better now with our planning. It's still happening. We're still approving. There's still threats to land in Morgan Hill and Gilroy. and in San Jose, where they're perfectly good uses, but in the wrong spot, in the wrong space, where there's land within the city, within the urban growth boundary. So Committee for Green Foothills is working on that. As for the legacy beyond that, I could think of a few. One, and I'd love to get other folks here. One is around just the fact that you almost have to drive if you live here. So we've built this auto-oriented, auto-centric type of development, and so if you live here, you have to drive, which is no good for climate change. It's no good for our health. Furthermore, it's no good for our public transportation system. So our public transportation system is failing in a lot of ways because the way that we've developed isn't really compatible with a vibrant public transportation system. And our communities are working to build more densely around that, and I have faith that in the next 10 years we're going to see a shift. But in this region, we're heavily having to subsidize our public transportation because of the way that we've grown.
Yeah, just to be clear, when you develop all those single-family homes and it's all spread out, when it's sprawled, it's really hard to get a concentration of population that can make transit efficient. We have the father of mass transit in Santa Clara County with us today. That must have been an incredibly hard battle to fight, to even get us started towards a transit system.
Terry, first I'd like to compliment Megan and the Committee for Green Foothills for doing such a good job for so many years. Back when you first got started, your founders would take us to dinner. Wally and Mary Stegner and the Duvenicks and the Varians would invite us to the Duvenick house for a nice dinner, and we would sit there and talk about things around the fire. It was kind of like the old tribe being told by the elders what we ought to do. The warriors were going to go out there and do what the elders were telling us to do, and we were the young warriors that came. And so you have a great legacy. When we built the transit system, which was master planned from a study begun in '73 called the Rapid Transit Development Project Phase 1 for Santa Clara County, when we built that system with supposedly 140 miles of light rail and high-speed rail, they didn't call it that at that time, but that's what it is now, and the commuter rail systems and BART and the bus systems and so on, it was envisioned that the cities would infill around those stations. That's what happens around transit all over the world. But because of the NIMBY opposition, the kind of
Not in my backyard.
NIMBY opposition to any kind of infill in our valley, the infill around the stations hasn't occurred. It's starting to occur now with the transit village concepts, which you're leading with Communiversity. But it hasn't occurred, and as a result, we're not putting ridership into the transit system. We're encouraging riders to get out on the roadway systems, which are now impassable. So fortunately, the cities are now buying into the idea of transit villages, and we're seeing infill developing on top of and around the 62 light rail stations and the many more commuter rail stations that are out there.
What do you think, Megan? Is that going to happen?
Well, I think just to comment on what you're saying around this transformation of really the environmental movement, going from, or just the public sentiment in general in this region, where we started as this grow, 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 and then folks like you were elected, no more growth, stop it, all growth is bad, all development is bad, to where we are now, and I think Committee for Green Foothills, the housing community, the labor, we're generally in the same pot of folks who believe that development can be a good thing in the right space and the right use. So it's amazing just to, I really truly believe that we're going to get those urban centers that our decision makers are planning for.
There's still a lot of resistance to the NIMBYs who don't want
Still is.
dense development, and people who still want to live in single-family homes with their own yards.
But I'll take exception to that. It has
Okay.
nothing to do with taking people out of their home. Like, people can stay in their homes, and it's about building more densely around transit. And there are opportunity
Well, I was talking about
areas.
the people that aren't in those homes but want to be in homes like
I
that,
see.
But
rather than in a high-rise condo
But one of the
downtown.
issues too is that you look at the transition, just in the last 20 years, there's been virtually in San Jose, virtually no single-family detached homes built.
Yeah.
Almost all the new housing has been in some form of an attached condominium apartment, and of course, you see what's going on in downtown San Jose today. I mean, this is unbelievable. During the 70s, when the sprawl was taking place, downtown San Jose was becoming a ghost town. Not only did the commercial development leave with Valley Fair Shopping Center as the starting point, but all the housing and all the neighborhoods. Your neighborhood, for example, was declining.
That's how I was able to afford to buy there.
Exactly. The housing costs were going down. People didn't want to live there because people were moving out into the suburbs. Today, that's totally turned around. And so now you've talked about high density housing that is actually happening not only in downtown, but at some of the transit villages. We've been working with the plan around the flea market, for example, with BART, all high density housing and higher density commercial development. And that's going to be a, quote, new transit village like was envisioned 50 years ago. It is just now beginning to happen.
Gary, the only criticism I'd have of that, and this is after going all over the world and giving speeches on this subject, is that other communities are putting 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 stories on top of transit instead of 4 or 5 stories.
Got a long way to go.
And we've got to get up to that 20 and 30 stories on top of the transit and parking, not in the neighborhoods.
Right.
And what the neighborhoods need to remember is that if you build that high density housing on top of transit, then you don't have to intrude into their neighborhoods, and you can still carry you can still house the jobs that are being created by Apple and Google and the other organizations that are expanding in the valley.
Let's let Don get a word in here.
That was a point that I made the other evening. I spoke to a group in Almaden Valley, and I've been making the point for the last several years that if you want to save great suburban neighborhoods, the way to do it is create great urban neighborhoods in the right places.
Did they buy it?
Well, some of them, the ones that were still paying attention at that point, One other point, if I may, just slightly.
Go.
One of the other legacies of the urban development policies we have that I think we overlook sometime is it wasn't just that it stopped sprawl, it also made possible for us to create an outstanding system of county parks and public open space lands around the valley, which otherwise would have been lost to development or had become too expensive to buy or whatever, gone to other uses. So that's one thing, another reason, even though maybe the sprawl has sort of stopped, we still need to maintain those policies very vigorously and defend them very vigorously, because once you start speculation going in the rural areas again, we won't be able to continue expanding that system the way we were. We won't be able to afford to do it. So that to me is one of the, it's often overlooked benefit of having urban development policy is it allows you to save permanently public lands around the periphery because you can afford them. Otherwise, the costs go way up or they get developed for other
And
uses.
Megan, that's a big thing with the Committee for Green Foothills, isn't it? Open space. And
I just wanted to comment on that in addition to protecting these lands just for recreation and because they're beautiful and it means that we're not sprawling, which means that we're saving money in our cities, these lands are also working for us. And our communities, our decision makers are actually starting to understand that it's not just some hippie idea, this idea of green infrastructure, the idea of nature working for us, cleaning our air, cleaning our water. We saw this with the passing of Measure T in November this year.
City of San Jose
where,
Measure T.
As a part, City of San Jose Measure T, where in addition to providing $650 million for roads, for repairing our sewer line, $50 million of that is going towards green infrastructure for protecting and restoring Coyote Valley as flood protection. So it's exciting to see this total transformation in the city of San Jose. And I really, 30 years from now when we're sitting here again, I feel like Measure T is going to be a big part of that transition of this idea of nature working for us and the stop of sprawl.
We've got just a couple minutes left. I'm going to give you each about 30 seconds for whatever final word you want to have. Don?
I just want to say we've been taking sort of a retrospective look. I think it's also important we take a quick prospective look. The latest projections from the state of California is roughly for Santa Clara County between 2015 and 2030 is we are going to be adding the equivalent of adding 300,000 more people to this valley, equivalent of 2 more Sunnyvales, not out at the periphery, but within the city. That's going to force us to become more urban, hopefully intelligently more urban is the way I put it. But the battle's not over, and the question is how do we accommodate that sort of growth?
Big question.
And how do we maintain a jobs housing balance or create a better balance overall and ideally for individual cities. One of the challenges for San Jose for decades is it became the bedroom community, so to speak, back in the 70s for the jobs in North County.
Which gave San Jose an inadequate tax base without enough
after Prop
industry and
13,
jobs,
that really became a
which the
penalty.
city's now struggling to remedy.
Exactly.
Rod, last words.
I read in Time Magazine's October 22nd issue on page 12 that they concluded that we have 12 years left to correct the climate change disaster, or it's too late to correct it, and we have lost the earth for mammals. Well, that's my grandbabies, and I'm going to do all I can to create infill that will allow us to get away from burning fossil fuel in automobiles so that those babies will have a future. And I hope that the people that are listening to us and watching us will do the same thing for the same reason.
Hey, good news. I misread the timing. We have 15 minutes left. So we can be.
Say the same thing over, only slower.
We can now
solve all of
expand
the world's problems
on what
in the
we've
next
been
15
talking about. Geez, you people are so efficient. Gary,
Well,
the floor is open to you. You have 15 minutes. No, please.
and I won't take it. But yeah, I think if you just see what's going on, and I like to use downtown and the downtown neighborhoods as a good example. Whereas in the 70s with the sprawl, it was all a decline. Now it's beginning to come back. People want to live downtown. People want to live in high rise.
The
Downtown,
millennials especially.
and downtown high rise is kind of a misnomer because of the airport. We can't change that dynamic, or there would be 40-story high rises in downtown San Jose today. But we're trying to maximize those, and you see it happening daily. Not only is industry doing it, so are housing development. The other thing is that the cost to provide service to these areas is substantially
Very good
more
point.
efficient.
Yeah.
Substantially more efficient. The old studies that showed that sprawled single-family development didn't pay for itself have been turned pretty much upside down. In fact, this kind of development that we're seeing, the urban village development that's higher density housing, can in fact generate enough revenue to provide for the services, whether it's police or fire services or expanding the local schools or
So
libraries.
that should make cities like San Jose more friendly to
That kind of housing.
that kind of housing. It isn't a net drain.
That's correct. And San Jose does continue to have a challenge with regard to tax base.
Yes.
Because California cities still are very dependent on property tax despite Prop 13. They're just also very dependent on sales tax, more dependent on sales tax today than they were prior to Prop 13. So development that generates both sales tax and property tax is important to balance the population growth.
Mm-hmm.
And the new general plan, the 2040 general plan, puts a heavy emphasis on adding jobs. Maybe a little too less, maybe a little insufficient emphasis on adding housing.
Right, but I mean, again, and it's a critical element though, because job growth in San Jose versus job growth in another city helps San Jose. And that's part of San Jose's dilemma, and always has been. So if it doesn't happen in San Jose, but it happens in, quote, Cupertino, and Cupertino's going through the debate right now with the Valco development. I mean, it's classic. It's a classic situation. And had the farmers in Cupertino didn't fight San Jose, we would love to have had Apple headquarters in San Jose.
One of the things we haven't talked about is, are you going around the circle, or you go ahead, Megan?
It's go right ahead.
One of the things I think is critical to the conversation about what kind of cities we should be building and what kind of development we should be approving going forward is that of that 300,000 population growth that the state is projecting for us, 2/3 of that is projected to be in the over 65 age group. Mm-hmm. We are becoming much older population, much more rapidly.
You're getting personal now, Doug.
Well, I'm already there, so I'll be pulling up on the rope behind me. They're pulling over the finish line. But for California, in fact, it's 3/4 of the projected growth over the next 15 years in California is in the over 65. The real question that raises for me is, how should we be planning our cities for an aging population?
Yeah.
And automobile dependency is certainly a critical factor. Now, autonomous vehicles may help some of that, but 1 out of 4 seniors doesn't drive, and more cut back. And so more and more people are going to be looking for walkable urban village sorts of environments to live in if they can move out of their current homes, or as they need to, or as they can't drive any longer.
Just to sort of tag on to that, we were having a conversation earlier just about this idea of the city of San Jose not building more single-family housing, and that being in some way a bad thing or something that people want, or there's a demand for that. And while I wouldn't disagree that, I think many of us would love to live in a single-family home, when it comes with weighing that with all of the services that we'd also like to have near our home, public transportation, grocery stores, pharmacies, healthcare, schools, that really it only makes sense to be building these kinds of walkable communities. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but we really can't have this, building more single-family housing with this walkable community.
Well, I'm going to be a skeptic.
All right, let's hear it.
It seems to me San Jose has done a terrible job of building the kind of community you two are talking about. I've lived downtown for 40 years. I can walk to a Walgreens, and that's it. That's it. Otherwise, I get in the car. And you look at the high rises around here where we are in the studio. There's housing, but on the ground floor, there's not retail. Where's the dry cleaner?
Yeah,
San Jose has done a terrible job. This all happened after Gary was the director of planning, of course.
Right.
But we also have thousands of new units that are coming up. So let's see what happens in 5 years.
Yeah, well,
the problem, though, part of that problem is in terms of retail.
Yeah.
Valley Fair killed downtown San Jose initially back in the 60s and is continuing to kill it in terms of retail.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the services, those services aren't going to come back to downtown until there's more people living downtown. However, unfortunately, not only living, but also some more working. And the dry cleaners will come. It's not in downtown, but the Coleman Center over where Target.
It's thriving, yes.
It's thriving. It's a booming center. And it's not walkable, but it's close. And it's a lot less environmentally disastrous to drive from your house to Coleman than it would be all the way to Valley Fair, for example.
Well, now we have those great scooters and bicycles.
Now you have scooters, and it's gonna be walkable to some of the new houses.
It's gonna be okay.
We're going to have all those elderly people like us Don, out on scooters. You better watch out.
I think I'm less concerned about the commercial support. That will come when the market comes. When you have a whole bunch of 20, 30-story towers in the downtown area, as high as you can go under the flight path, you're going to have commercial downtown because you're going to have a market downtown. But by that time, we're not going to do the other amenities that make great communities. For example, you have a wonderful potential Central Park in the Park of the Guadalupe, the Coleman area up to the airport. That's 250 acres. It could be a beautiful Central Park that would rival any in the world. And it's being chipped away at by the city now with bits and pieces that are being proposed to go into commercial development. That should be an absolute no-no. They should have a master plan for the creation of a high density, but not high density, but a high capacity Central Park that would be there for people to walk in, to walk their dogs, to take friends, and to take their children over to the Rotary Play Garden. That's the way it should be for the rest of that park. And unfortunately, the city lacks a vision and has now had several proposals of developing portions of that park for commercial purposes. And instead of buying up the rest of that commercial mess along Coleman Avenue and putting it into the park.
Well, we have wonderful organizations like Spur and the Knight Foundation that are hosting convenings around this issue, and maybe there is a possible good future for the Guadalupe. But yeah, we can't keep chipping away at it without a master plan.
But even Spur needs to be more aggressive about saying, no, you cannot develop commercial in that area. You got to take the rest of that land that's bounded by Coleman Avenue and put it into the park so you have a lump of area that the public can recognize as an indelible park that would be a rival to Central Park, New York.
Don?
Two quick points going back sort of on the aging issue. A factoid for you. By 2030, it's projected that 1/4 of the adult population of Santa Clara County will be over 65. We have never had that old a population in our country's history. And related to that, when I go out and give presentations about the future of the county, I always ask, I put a couple of sort of hypothetical letters up on the screen. I say, imagine you got to pick a letter from this couple. It's an elderly couple, and it reads as follows. My wife and I have lived in our single family home in this community for the last 40 years. We now would like to move somewhere else where we continue to live an active and independent lifestyle without owning an automobile. Does your city have a neighborhood like that we can move to?
Nope.
And I ask the same question if you're getting it from millennials. We're the young people who your economy depends on. We'd like to live in places where we don't have to drive automobiles. But live active and independent life? Does your city have neighborhoods like that we can move to? If the answer is no, your city is not ready for either the present or the future. That to me is my simplistic sort of report card or checklist for whether urban planning is succeeding in this or any other valley around here for that matter.
One
Terry,
vital sign of life downtown has been San Pedro Square, which is thriving.
except it doesn't have enough capacity.
Right.
You could-
And it's all
quadruple it.
entertainment and food and not neighborhood services, but it's busy. There are people there.
Right.
Yeah, there's demand.
There's life there, yeah.
Yeah.
Don mentioned two population groups that are rapidly expanding in our state. One are the seniors, and the other is the millennials. Neither of them, the majority of neither of them, want to have single-family dwellings. They want to have opportunities to live in areas that's supported by commercial, supported by walkable communities, supported by good transit systems, and so that they can go to work without having to get on the highways. And that's a market that ought to be tapped. And it's a market that's going to be there for a long time in the future for our development community.
And if we ever build the kind of community you all are talking about that's got street life and neighborhood services and so on, it'll be so much easier to sell higher density development to the not in my backyard
Yeah,
folks.
yeah.
You bet.
You need a successful model.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And we don't have one.
That's,
Well,
he said that.
the prune yard, not prune yard, but the
Coleman?
flea market
Flea market.
Flea market.
might be your
Yeah.
opportunity for that.
Yes, yes, that's the nearest one.
Well, and the flea market is going to have supermarkets, walking distance from all that housing. Going to have jobs. It's going to have BART, and it's going to be truly a model for new model for the transit-oriented development.
I went to the first meeting of the community meeting on what should happen to the San Jose Hospital site. It's about a 3 square block site right downtown on East Santa Clara Street. And when the community found out there could be ground floor retail, they're all for the density. They're all for the density. If there's, basically they said, if there's something for us, we like this project. But when the consultants were saying, oh, it's going to be offices and housing, they were saying, well, I don't know. But ground floor retail, if it works, there are a lot of neighborhoods really hungry for it in San Jose. I think it can happen. Now we really are at our last 3 minutes. So I'm going to give everybody another chance for a last word. We're going to start with Megan this time.
Rod, you took one of my last points, which is around climate change, and that IPCC report, where we have 12 years to, what they said is we have 12 years to change life as we know it, civilization as we know it. What we're talking about right now is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the kind of changes that need to take place. I am heartened and I find hope in the fact that people care, and together we have shifted the way that this entire region looks. It could have been a whole lot worse. We could have had no hillsides, no Coyote Valley, no farmland, no forest, basically no bay, oil drills on our coast. It could have been a very different place. I take hope in the fact that people can come together, rally, and do what needs to be done so that my child, your grandchildren can live here and they have animals and wildlife and to enjoy and beautiful places to visit.
And voters have supported that on several campaigns you've been
we
involved
have-
with.
I think the public
Open
wants it.
space, infrastructure, good planning.
The public wants it.
Yep. When the public votes, the public wins.
Now we're down to a minute.
A huge challenge that we have is going to be the whole affordability of housing.
Yes.
And
Yes. Can people actually
and
afford
again,
to stay here?
single-family detached houses isn't going to do it.
Yeah.
And just and affordable housing also needs to be close to jobs, close to retail. And I think so some of the concepts that are being developed in and around the downtown area with affordable housing that can include affordable housing will be also part of the future. It's a model for other transit villages.
And I'm building a granny flat in my backyard. So
That's good.
One small step.
That's it.
Guys, we're out of time, so I can't give you a second last word, but you had your earlier last word, so I don't feel too guilty about that. So that's our show for today. We hope everybody will join us again next month. Meanwhile, you can catch up on previous shows on our website at createtvsj.org or on YouTube by searching for Create TV San Jose. And you can let us know what you think about our show and our guests and suggest future topics or guests by email at valleypolitics@createtvsanjose.org, on Twitter at valley_politics, and by following us on Facebook. And now that's all, folks. Thanks for watching Valley Politics. We'll see you next month.